Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the Great Armistice Day, controversy in the United Kingdom, the U.S. election results, and the Republican debate. I'm joined by Saraba Mari, Nina Power, and Jeff Schellenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. Nina, you live in London. Right now there's a big controversy about a planned protest in favor of Palestine against the Israeli attack on Gaza, a plan to coincide with Armistice Day in the United Kingdom, implicating the cenotaph. Can you just kind of tell us what the cenotaph is, for our American listeners, and tell us a little bit about the controversy swirling around this planned protest?
Yeah, so obviously Armistice Day is signifies the end of hostilities. It's the 11th of November. The cenotaph is a memorial to our glorious dead. The Remembrance Weekend, the Armistice is on the Saturday, falls on the Saturday this year. The Remembrance Weekend is generally marked, commemorated on the Sunday, which with church services and parades and so on. So it's a kind of memorial to fallen soldiers. And I suppose what's happened is this kind of big political flashpoint. There have been a whole series of pro-Palestinian protests, some of which have featured, many would argue anti-Semitic slogans or pro-Hamas slogans. The police have been arresting not people necessarily who make those slogans, but rather people who are bringing Union Jacks and so on. And it's become this serious point of contention. We've had people on the right calling for patriots to come on Saturday to protect our civilization, to protect our war dead, to commemorate the end of World War II. On the other hand, you have members of people on the left saying, well, surely Armistice Day is the best day to call for a ceasefire, which many of them are calling for. And obviously the UK government have not called for a ceasefire, unlike many other governments. The government themselves have not banned the march. Some people were calling for a ban because of the obvious point of potential conflict between people who are pro-Palestinian, left-wing activists, and, let us say, patriots, people on the right who are maybe in some sense seeing this as a call to arms. Although equally, you have people saying, don't go, it's a trap. So there's many ideas floating around. But no doubt it's an extremely fraught and potentially dangerous situation. The march itself is not necessarily going to go by the cenotaph. I think there might be a way of avoiding these kind of geographical flashpoints at least. But it's certainly true to say that the discussion around this has also been tied into questions of immigration and deportation in the last few weeks, with many people saying that people who are pro-Hamas should be deported, that their values are not compatible with our values in the UK. And I think many grievances have been condensed. We have a very weak Conservative government. They're not going to cancel the protest. The police have said they're not going to cancel the protest. They are sort of pleading for people to be well behaved, which again is not being seen in particularly positive light by any side, frankly. And I think there is a lot of anxiety about what might happen. I mean, I obviously seriously hope that nothing happens and that people are allowed to protest, as is their right. But there are ongoing, very difficult questions about the limits of democratic society and the kinds of things that people can say in the streets. And obviously the Jewish community, which is much smaller than the Muslim community. We have maybe less than 1% of people in Britain are Jewish. Something like 15% or something like that are in London are Muslim, so the numbers are quite asymmetrical. Many Jewish people are clearly feeling extremely anxious. There have been a series of kind of anti-Semitic incidents. So, yeah, I don't know what to say about it really, other than the police do not seem strong. The government doesn't seem strong. I think there will be many people out on the street, some of whom will have not necessarily great intentions and might be looking for a fight, but let's hope it remains peaceful, and that people also get to remember those who died in the world wars that British soldiers fought in as well.
Jeff, I know you were in D.C. in recent days. I saw a pro-Palestine, pro-ceasefire protest there. How does that differ from what we're seeing in London and Paris and elsewhere? Or was it really in keeping with those protests?
I would guess it's a bit different. I'm going to speak in generalizations and without particular expertise. I saw the protest in DC as I happened to be there over the weekend. It was quite large. Estimates of the crowd vary, but may have been around 100,000 people. It was seemingly a pretty orderly protest. I think there were people kind of climbing up the White House fence, apparently shouting, "Fuck Joe Biden" at one point. It would have been better if they'd been shouting, "Let's go Brandon," but one can't have everything one would wish for. The overall appearance of it was, that was quite similar to plenty of other protests on all kinds of issues that happen regularly in DC. My anecdotal impression, just observing it, was that it was, a very large gathering of Muslim Americans and presumably, a mix of American citizens and immigrants. I saw families, people of different ages, but definitely I saw mothers, fathers, and children, older people. And so it did seem to be, one thing that was notable about it was, you saw this identifiably kind of left-wing activist presence in the crowd, but it seemed like a large portion of it was pretty sort of average-looking people. Again, many of them families, older people, as well as younger people, etc. And so it did seem to be a significant gathering of American Muslims, perhaps Arab Americans, not necessarily Muslim, but Christian. But in any case, that kind of stood out to me. Going on how this would compare to, the concerns about what's happening in England, as well as the fact that in other countries in Europe, there have been attempts to ban, some of these protests, attempts to ban certain political expression in favor of the Palestinian cause, which I think is disastrous and in keeping with the, much more harshly authoritarian measures we saw against, freedom of assembly during the pandemic than we saw in the U.S. and other, major crackdowns on expression and protest in Europe over various issues in recent years. It does strike me that, basically the Muslim community in the U.S. is, not usually associated with the kinds of sort of social dysfunction and, problems of integration that you often see as the case in Europe and the UK, where, you have this sense of these communities that are quite isolated sort of to some extent deliberately isolated from the, on both sides, right? Cordoned off from the population at large and have also kind of cordoned themselves off culturally and socially. And that this, creates a huge amount of tension and conflict, and that these populations sometimes explode, as happened in France with the riots earlier this year. And so, I think there's a strong consciousness that in various countries like France, that the Muslim immigrant population is one that is prone to explode in quite damaging riots and just kind of socially destabilizing political sort of mass actions. And so there's a huge concern about that occurring. And I would take that to be, perhaps there's nothing quite as significant in recent UK history as in some places like France, but nevertheless, I assume that's part of the backdrop here, that this, it's taken that among the Islamic communities are, although you have many sort of long-standing Islamic communities in Britain, which are reasonably successful and well integrated, you also have, pretty sort of disaffected and socially marginalized communities that might be seen as prone to like tipping over into really damaging riots and so on. And, I don't think when you look at like the people I saw protesting in DC last week, this did not come across as a crowd that would be likely to go in that direction. In fact, it would be much more likely to be the young sort of left activist types who you'd expect to start smashing windows. It's generally the case that a lot of Muslims in America are sort of middle class, often professionals or, small business owners. And so they have a certain kind of stake in the society. I think those kind of socioeconomic and demographic differences are salient here. There isn't really a significant example of this community kind of exploding into, violent rioting of the sort that we've seen in places like France. So although I'll just put a caveat here and say that, obviously the one thing that where there is a clear commonality is you have a Jewish population in the U.S. that, has often seen these, expressions of Palestine solidarity and so on as clearly kind of, tipping over into straight up anti-Semitism. And I would note, I don't know that much about this incident. I'm not sure how much is known about it more broadly, but you did have a sort of, protest and counter protest of pro-Palestine and pro-Israel groups in Los Angeles over the weekend that did tip over into an altercation, and in which an older Jewish man was killed, which, as far as I know, was the first such incident. But I think will certainly feed these fears that, lurking beneath this protest is a kind of, anti-Semitic agenda that could lead to violence, particularly towards Jews. And then you have also had, incidents of vandalism of Jewish organizations and, Jewish businesses and things like that. And so, clearly there's been some concern about that. Who exactly that would come from is maybe not as clear cut in the U.S., where you have a Muslim community that's more, I'd say, kind of overall more integrated in some ways, and where you're less likely to have this kind of, just sense of the kind of explosive potential of, say, the banlieue in Paris and places like that. And so instead it might be that, people be worried it would be like some kind of, violent Antifa type protesters who might, engage in like vandalism against Jewish organizations or something like that. It would, it wouldn't necessarily come from this particular demographic quadrant. So, I think although some of the concerns, around these protests have been the same, my sense is probably that's a salient difference. I don't know if that accords with your impression, Nina, but.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I suppose I was more kind of reflecting on the weakness at the top. I mean, I was just looking at the language used. So we had our Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who's generally positioned as being quite sort of right-wing in the Tory party and kind of has made comments about immigration, describing the march on Saturday as a hate march, which many people have seen as an inflammatory rhetoric. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has basically sort of passed the buck to the police and said, if anything happens, it's on you. I don't really want this to go ahead. We've probably got some legislation that could stop it. But of course, you've got civil liberty tensions. We've got the right to protest. Yeah, I think, we do have a very well integrated Muslim community in the main. But I think also since Brexit, really, because we were getting immigration from Eastern Europe and that stopped. And now we have global immigration, most of which is largely Muslim. So we have a very large number of recent Muslim immigrants, basically, fleeing from war zones, but also economic migrants. So we do have a very large number, I'd say, I don't know the number, but of young men who are in their late teens, late 20s, who are here without families, who are deracinated. And in many ways, you can kind of empathise with the desire to go out on the street and around a unifying issue and hang out with people who speak the same language as you in a city in which your job is probably likely to be, an Uber Eats cyclist or something kind of badly paid and probably a bit demeaning. So, from another point of view, I can totally understand why Palestine has become this rallying issue. What are we going to do? I mean, we have this kind of very extremely multivarious society that has all kinds of histories, all kinds of feelings. Maybe the best thing is if it rains all day. Like maybe the British solution is simply rain. Let's hope.
Pray for rain. It's worth noting here, actually, I just realized another news item that's somewhat relevant to this is we did just have the House of Representatives censure Representative Rashida Tlaib, who's the only Palestinian American in Congress, and basically on the basis of statements and posts she had made in the wake of Hamas's attack. So, just in terms of this question of leadership and how it's responding to these things, I don't think there's been, you've had certain kind of calls to crack down or to deport people who support Hamas and things like that. But as far as I can tell, that's the only kind of notable response we've seen so far. And it did involve Democrats and Republicans both voting to censure their colleague. I tend to think that was probably a bad move in my view, but I don't know if my colleagues agree.
I haven't paid any attention to the House's censuring of Rashida Tlaib. I think some congressmen or women on the right were somewhat recently censured, and I can't say I paid any attention to that either. It seems to not be a lot of reality there. It's not always clear what the stakes of these things are. Big question that we've seen coming out of this controversy over Israel, Gaza, is one for the Democratic Party here in the U.S. Will dissatisfaction with the stance the Biden administration has taken lead to a decline in Muslim American support for the Democrats? Muslims voted in high numbers for George W. Bush in 2000. In certain ways, they're kind of obvious voters for a party like the GOP. Many, as you mentioned, Jeff, are small businessmen. Islam is not notably progressive in its ideas regarding sexual roles, gender, and yet, in part because of the American right's suspicion of Islam, Muslims in America moved to the Democratic Party over the course of the Bush administration. Turned out for Biden in 2020. They're a small part of the population, but they are important in Michigan, most notably, which is a very important swing state. So there have been questions about that, and we saw news this week. The New York Times and Siena put out a large, well-respected poll showing that Biden has fallen behind Trump by a significant margin in 5 of 6 swing states. It seems from that poll, just to connect the thread here, that it's hard to tell, the sample is small, but we're not seeing yet a measurable decline in Muslim support for Biden. It's not really clear that, certainly, going from Biden to Trump wouldn't lead to wouldn't be a kind of more pro-ceasefire position. The GOP is likely to support Israel's actions even more firmly than the Democratic Party does. But you could potentially see some people check out of the process altogether. I do want to talk a little bit, get input from all of you. Nina, maybe we'll let you off, but at least from Jeff, I want to get some input on these polling results, which were pretty widely discussed. We also had one of these kind of off-cycle elections, races in Virginia, there were races in New York, big abortion ballot measure in Ohio. Jeff, Saurabh, what do you got?
Well, on the question of Muslims turning against the Democratic Party, you certainly see a lot of expressions of, anecdotally, expressions of discontent on Twitter or in the traditional media. But for the reasons you just spelled out, Matthew, I don't think that will translate into like mass enthusiasm for candidate Trump. Reason being, as you laid it out, that there's every reason to expect that Trump, in his support of Israel, would be even more hardline. And now we can go into the kind of Trump foreign policy philosophy that represents. It is not the same kind of liberal internationalist or neoconservative ideology of Atlanticists in Washington or London. It doesn't have that kind of democratizing hope or nation-building hope, anything like that. And I think that's what made it really attractive in 2016. But at the same time, it is pretty hard-edged about supporting core U.S. allies like Israel, as indeed Trump was in some ways the most pro-Israel president in American history. He moved the embassy from U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He, as part of an attempt to step away from the region, he assassinated a major foe of Israel in the region, namely Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Just the people who staffed his kind of Mideast desk were as pro-Israel as they come. So that's one reason. And the second is, a lot of the, insofar as these people are first, second generation immigrants, immigration is an issue that is important to them. And they associate Trump with the call to ban all Muslims from entering the country until we figure out what the hell is going on. And then subsequently, the actual executive order that came down in the early days of the Trump administration, this feels like ancient history, but it was really only 7 years ago or so, was the kind of ban on visitors and immigrants from 7 kind of terror-producing countries. Nevertheless, those 2 reasons make me think that although the emotions may be running high, you're not going to see people voting for Trump as a form of revenge against Biden. The more likely thing is what you mentioned, again, Matthew, you already said this, but that they will tune out of the process. Like they'll just conclude that both parties are bad for their people and become cynical. And I don't know what effect that has on I think in the case of the state of Michigan, which is a battleground state, I think that actually is marginally significant if they become unenthusiastic about Biden. Elsewhere, like those other states in the Siena poll that the New York Times published, do they have significant Muslim minorities that would tip elections one way or another? I don't think so. So it's kind of a wash.
So we have a piece that will cover all of this coming out, so people can look out for that. It's worth noting, you do have a few glimmers within the kind of populist, sort of more heterodox right side of things of, a position that might be more appealing, particularly because you did have Muslims, and the piece will cover this, joining conservative Christians and rejecting pro-LGBT sort of school curricula and engaging in activism against this stuff. And then in, one city in Michigan, Muslim-dominated city council, voted to remove pride flags from city property. So you do have, certain of those kind of alignments over social issues, culture war issues in recent years. So clearly that was seen by some as a kind of opportunity for some, conservative candidates to pick up votes. But, then with regard to the Israel-Palestine issue, you do see, say, Tucker Carlson, obviously a kind of significant figure on the populist right, not really going along with the party's kind of all in for Israel stance. And then you also have Representative Thomas Massey, who's kind of considered, something of a star by some, also, voting with the kind of left of the Democratic Party, not being all in for a kind of aid package to Israel, and also voting against the censure of Tlaib, which I mentioned previously. So, you do have a little bit of indication. And then the other thing that's worth adding here, which is kind of curious, is you have people on the Israeli right and actually on the kind of Zionist side of things who are in favor of, reducing Israel's dependence on U.S. aid for the reason that it is seen as constraining what Israel can do. So in other words, if Israel is cut loose, it doesn't get the aid anymore, but it also is kind of not being kept on a leash by Anthony Blinken. And so, you could sort of imagine a isolationist or sort of America first type, policy on the right that would actually find kind of allies on the Israeli right who would see it as an opportunity to, essentially liberate themselves from the Washington foreign policy establishment's sort of tutelage. So none of that really adds up to anything that's likely to produce any results at the moment. But those are kind of interesting glimpses of places this would go that, wouldn't necessarily certainly wouldn't make the establishment happy, would also not make the left happy, even though it could involve, cutting aid to Israel, because it would also mean, by doing so, empowering the most kind of revanchist factions of Israeli politics.
I do want to kind of step away from the Muslim American conversation and talk just a bit, in broader terms about the New York Times Siena poll, which landed like a bombshell among, many kind of right-thinking people, because it indicated that after everything we've seen, after Trump's very provocative 2016 campaign, after his somewhat shambolic presidency and its undignified denouement on January 6th, still, a lot of people are prepared to vote for Trump over Biden. And these would be Biden to Trump voters, not, it's not the fact that suddenly, boomer white male retirees are becoming more numerous in America. That's not the case. Instead, you have young people, many of whom are Hispanic or Black, concerned about seemingly about things like inflation, and persuaded that Trump would do a better job handling the economy than Biden has done. A lot, these are many of these, voters, give an advantage to the Democratic Party on issues like abortion, defending democracy. Those are the two issues where the Democratic Party, is faring better, or the Democratic, candidate is faring better than Trump or the GOP. But still, a lot of people very surprised by the apparent willingness of a majority of the country to entertain re-electing Trump.
Well, it seems, for one thing, evidence of the limitations of the kind of massive machine for, forming and enforcing a kind of consensus, that has been, that existed in the pre-social media and the internet era, in the form of what Noam Chomsky called manufacturing consent, right? In the day of the sort of traditional news media. In some ways, its powers have only grown despite the initial idea that, social media and the internet would kind of multiply the channels and thereby challenge the sort of monopolization of opinion making by a few major corporate entities. Nonetheless, these corporate entities have overall continued to gain strength and kind of concentrate their power, and as well as the rise of big tech as another kind of opinion forming and enforcing machine that works in concert with the corporate media and the state, as we've seen revealed in various ways, to attempt to ensure that people toe the line in various ways. But I think in part what these results show is the powers, and the often kind of dystopian powers we might ascribe, very very worriedly to all of these sort of technologies and apparatuses. Are perhaps not as great as we might think. In other words, that it's actually not possible for them to, despite everything that's occurred and despite full spectrum campaign of resolute opposition, it's not possible for them to persuade a majority of people that a particular political figure is beyond the pale. And then, in fact, many people will, for quite simple reasons, such as, they don't feel like their lives are that great in sort of material economic terms at the moment. And in fact, they remember maybe they were a bit better a few years before when this other figure was in charge. And that's enough to make them think, all right, well, yeah, I would try again with him, in spite of all the other spectacular things that, seem to discredit him. So, it's a remarkable result just for that reason, as well as I think just raising a question of, that on one hand, it seems like a lot of this is sort of material and economic. On the other hand, I think you can point to, as we discussed a previous week, some of the economic indicators being seemingly quite positive. So there's clearly some kind of malaise, that I would trace partly to sort of COVID and, completely bizarre revolution that brought about in people's lives in all sorts of ways, that seems to have just kind of set everything off kilter and made everything a little bit harder to assess. But, those are just some stray thoughts.
I think there are several takeaways last night where various kind of elections took place. Legislative elections in some states. You had ballot measures as well, especially on abortion and other cultural issues like marijuana. The upshot of all of that, at the risk of grossly overgeneralizing, is just basically the GOP had a terrible, terrible night. They lost on the abortion ballot measures, where Ohio residents, for example, wanted to enshrine in their constitution a constitutional right to abortion, in marijuana as well, legalization in Ohio. Governor Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, promising Republican governor of Virginia, will now face a Democratic-controlled legislature, and on and on. I'm trying to wrap my head around this from very different angles. Obviously, Matthew and I are very, very strongly pro-life. So maybe this was one way to say is that this is that was always priced in with the Dobbs decision. And so it's worth it, as it were. You're going to have to pay a price. But I think there's some deeper point about Republican malaise. And speaking of malaise, because I know Jeff was just riffing on that theme as well. But if the Republican Party were a coherent party right now, beyond Trump and all that he represents personally, there is a policy agenda there, but there's also just the person of Trump. But without Trump, the Republican Party is just meaningless thing. It's actually very, very much adrift and in a rut in the same way that the Tories in Britain are, except the odd thing is that the Tories at least have the excuse of having been in power continuously for running on a decade and a half now. And so, okay, you've had the same party. People are going to be both internally tired of power in some ways. And of course, the voters out there are going to be tired of you in power, even if you were great at governing, and which the Tories certainly weren't. But with Republicans, they've been in and out of power. Their hold on the House is tenuous. They don't have the Senate. When they had the executive branch under Trump, it was constantly besieged and assailed by this kind of establishment forces that wanted to unseat him in various ways. And like through it all, a party has emerged that I don't know, somehow doesn't cohere into real kind of coalitional interests, which is how you have a successful political party in the United States. You have to sort of bring together various interests, and all of our parties, both of our parties, since the rise of the most recent party system, Lincoln's GOP, have been these kind of coalitional mixes of interest groups. And I just think that the Republican one is just falling apart. It has a somewhat of a working class base, but it doesn't really service them with a working class agenda. It has certainly its small business component that's very, very strong, but it's also very much beholden to kind of plutocratic wings of American capital. And it just doesn't have a vision that I think, it's all reactive. So it's like, it's fine to contest what's taught in schools, or it's fine to contest what's taught in school libraries and so on. But just that's all there is to the party. And so in the absence of something very attractive otherwise, then abortion weighs down on the party much more than it might otherwise. If this were a party that had an attractive national vision for the country, then I think it could absorb the blows that come with overthrowing Roe v. Wade much better than it does. I don't know if you agree, Matthew, but that's I'm like, there's something wrong with the party as such. And that's why the abortion result hurts more than maybe it should.
Yeah. Just kind of speaking speculatively about the Ohio results, I tend to regard those as thermostatic, as an expression on the part of the people of Ohio. They don't want a sudden shift in the way that abortion is governed in this country. It's not a vote for a more pro-abortion America. It's a vote against a significantly more anti-abortion America, right? They want to try to maintain, I think it was a vote by people who wanted to basically maintain things as they were. It's a very clear setback for the pro-life cause. Far from surprising that people would have small c conservative instinct. That's not hugely surprising. America is a democracy. It's a very imperfect one. Public opinion can be shaped, formed, led by things like court decisions. We saw that in the case of gay marriage, where various ballot resolutions were invalidated by court decisions. But also those court decisions had a kind of complex interplay with softening of public opinion toward gay marriage, and they were part of the creation of a new consensus in favor of same-sex marriage. And so in our country, advancing the pro-life cause has to work in that way in some manner. It doesn't by no means has to work exclusively through the ballot box, but it has to occur with some kind of democratic assent. That's just going to have to occur. I've seen, on Twitter, people who are on the right or who want to be on the right for some issue say that they don't like wokeness, right? And so they would like to look to the GOP as a vehicle for fighting wokeness, but they're pro-choice, or they don't like pro-lifers. Their proposal is, well, we should just drop this issue. You should get pro-lifers out of the GOP. Jeff, you had a good article in another publication, and may I be forgiven for mentioning a publication that isn't compact, but I think you wrote this for Unheard. and in that piece, just correct me if I'm kind of misrepresenting it, but as I recall, you just pointed out that the GOP, if abortion is sometimes seen as weighing on it electorally, the anti-abortion movement is very important for the GOP because, and I might be going beyond what you say in the article, but these are at least the thoughts that it inspired. Opposition to abortion is the only cause that kind of lends the party some kind of moral energy. And then speaking much more concretely, it's like one of the only causes that kind of gives it access to an important and very committed pool of activists. People who are prepared to knock on doors or go to marches or hold up signs. Those people are not, the left may be saying, can we get rid of some of these people? We have too many around. There aren't that many on the right. The GOP doesn't have just tons of people who are prepared to go out into the street, be perceived as a little weird, but try to move society in a certain direction. The pro-lifers can provide that to the GOP. I'm sorry, I might be misrepresenting this article. I think it wasn't Unheard though, right?
Correct. Yeah. It's, So the piece was published earlier this year after, some of the other kind of local elections that seemed to suggest this was a weakness. And I think it was in response to, basically as I think you were indicating, Matthew, a number of these kind of anti-woke type pundits who have sort of, at least come to see the right as more the kind of vehicle for their politics, even though they're often sort of more on the kind of centrist liberal end of things in many respects. And so they're kind of like, why can't we just get rid of this dead weight of this losing cause that is far less popular than like whatever, opposing teaching 3-year-olds about gender identity or whatever. Like, surely we can all unite around and like create a broad tent around like being opposed to 3-year-olds learning about gender identity. So I think there's kind of a question about thinking about politics in terms of polling versus thinking about it organizationally. And so, as Matthew said, I think part of what's significant here is that you have basically a kind of organizational strength that, doesn't necessarily equate to being able to command large sort of majorities in polls, but that does, serve a function in the actual on the ground operations of politics. And so, yeah, I think that's the way I defined it in Peace was Culture War 1.0 versus Culture War 2.0. And my argument was that Culture War 2.0, which, basically I would think of as these kind of causes that have only become significant in the past 5 or 10 years, let's say, and often really just in the past like 2 or 3 years, they tend to produce a lot of social media sound and fury, but they haven't really amounted to any significant organizational structure. Whereas something like abortion the debate has remained, particularly kind of pre-Dobbs, it remained largely unchanged in various ways for decades. There weren't really major shifts, and it kind of seemed like it was just kind of going on in the background. At that same time, the pro-life side actually was able to, repeatedly, and now it seems on the back foot, but it was able to heavily restrict access to abortion in, various parts of the country just through sheer kind of organizational persistence and, kind of being willing to play the long game and not really win any, spectacular sort of victories in public opinion, but just, figure out how to achieve what it wanted to achieve using the mechanisms available to it. And so it just represents seemingly a very different kind of politics that dates back to this, sort of pre-social media era and, kind of makes up in organizational depth and breadth, like what it does or what it loses in being able to kind of win the sort of big contests over public opinion. And so, yeah, I think there is kind of a question, here about like how politics is done. I think often people are prone to underrate the kind of politics being done on that end of things, given what is more salient to us on a day-to-day basis. So, yeah, I think that is a key question. It's kind of why it seems unlikely that, despite these setbacks, there's going to be just this kind of jettisoning of the sort of pro-life contingent from the sort of conservative coalition.
Yeah, Jeff, it's been interesting to observe the controversy over abortion in the Republican primaries. I think, more than one candidate hoped to defeat Trump in the early stages of the campaign by running to his right on abortion, and particularly hoped thereby to best him in Iowa, where the caucus process is, in the GOP by conservative evangelicals whose most deeply felt political issue is opposition to abortion. And as part of that, Ron DeSantis signed a 6-week abortion ban, a heartbeat bill, did so in a midnight ceremony with a minimum of fanfare, indicating the awareness on the part of his campaign that this was an issue that didn't necessarily play well outside the kind of highly committed activist base, but they wanted to deliver that to the activist base. And then Trump really angered some important pro-life leaders by criticizing DeSantis for doing that. He angered pro-life leaders, but in at least one prominent case, the leader later kind of made up with Trump. And that probably reflects the fact that the pro-lifers don't really have anywhere else to go, and Trump is quite likely to be the nominee. But I think also Trump's line on this, even though he's the president responsible for appointing the judges who got rid of Dobbs, even though he's spoken against abortion in terms stronger than any previous Republican nominee ever has done, in 2016 during the last presidential debate when he said that Hillary wants it to be legal, a baby to be ripped out of the womb. That kind of language, ripped out of the womb, had never been used, not just, in a Republican presidential debate, but on primetime American television. Never had anything like that ever been aired, on kind of on a mainstream American broadcast. So Trump's visceral language, his willingness to appoint judges who, as he said, would overturn Roe. He made a definite promise they will overturn Roe. He was very pro-life in that way. Did a lot for the cause, but nobody really thinks that this is an animating issue for him, even if he has a strong revulsion at the idea of abortion. And he's kind of displayed a sense that, a certain moderation is needed on the issue. Somehow he's able to kind of project greater moderation on it than a lot of GOP candidates have done. I think that just in kind of brute electoral terms, that's going to be to his advantage. Again, given that we live in a society where elections occur and do matter, people, not least people who oppose abortion, need to think very carefully about the sensibilities of their fellow citizens who have less certain views, and to try to take those into account when they discuss the issue.
I mean, just very briefly from the outside on the weed issue, having visited America a few times in the last few years, I was really quite struck and quite horrified, frankly, by the amount of weed smoking that is apparent in your great nation. And I don't know how closely the sort of votes on abortion are tied to the votes on weed. I don't know whether we should take the sort of desire to make weed legal positively. I would suggest not. I think it's a terrible drug. Personally, I think it induces laziness and paranoia and many other negative modes of being. So I don't know what this particular vote says about the people who voted for it.
I mean, I think it reflects a sort of libertarian instinct, and it's an issue that's done well in states that are pretty Republican, but overall there are plenty of issues to be raised with how it has gone forward, and with the kind of weed industry, and with the nature of the products being sold now. But, it does seem like for the moment, the overall trend is America's kind of libertarian, permissive attitude towards kind of private consumption of things is strengthening. And then that also you have a kind of positive feedback cycle where, the bigger the industry becomes, the more allies it's able to find politically, including on the, in Ohio, former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, right, who's now a lobbyist, is, very much on the legalized weed side of things. That just seems to be the current trend, even though there has been some kind of buyer's remorse and maybe a bit of backlash. I mean, I tend to be myself of the kind of that it was oversold in all sorts of ways as a panacea. It has created all kinds of new problems and undesirable effects. I also don't really buy the kind of Alex Berenson kind of apocalyptic catastrophe narrative of it either. My sense is it will probably settle into there are certain areas of dysfunction that will come out of it, as they do from alcohol, that will just kind of be accommodated just because it seems to accord with Americans' kind of libertarian instincts.
Gotta say, I hate the smell. And just have an antipathy to the associated kind of cultural markers around weed. I think your kind of presentation of it is about right, and the analogy to alcohol is probably right in a lot of ways. It seems that maybe weed is more prone to make you insane. Maybe it doesn't make you as violent in certain ways as alcohol does. So I think we're going to become much, much more familiar with its ill effects. It would have been better if it had not been liberalized, but now that it has been, as with alcohol, an attempt to roll that back, no doubt bring very great benefits, just as Prohibition did, but boy, would there be downsides. So we're going to have to try to find a way to manage it.
One thing I've noticed has completely disappeared is the hippie kind of patchouli oil weed. I remember, because I went to college in part in the Mountain West and in part in the Pacific West in Seattle. And there was that culture of weed that was the Grateful Dead and like putting on like Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon.
Basically stuff Merle Haggard dislikes.
Yes. And like all of that has somewhat disappeared. It's all much harsher, I think. You don't see that kind of, I guess maybe even in the 90s and 2000s when I encountered it, it was already a kind of cultural revival of certain things that had happened in the 60s. And so it was a kind of, it was a LARP in its own way. But even the LARP is gone. It's just this like really, really, really strong weed. I still think one of the greatest op-eds in the history of the New York Times was by Maureen Dowd. I don't know if you guys remember this, when she went to Colorado, bought weed brownies, and she had no sense of how much to dose. So she like had just an enormous amount and became insanely paranoid. Like recounts like walking around her hotel room with like a towel over her head, like sort of trying to exercise whatever demon she thought was haunting her. I mean, I'm only vaguely remembering this, but it's like, it's like 700 words devoted to, I mean, there's an argument there, which is that, this ain't your college, swag. It's unbelievably purified and strong, and it messes with your head. I wonder if it's folly now to try to roll it back systematically, because it's become, once people have a certain liberty, it's very hard to retract it. One thing that's very confusing is that on paper and federal law it remains a whatever category 4, I can't remember, Schedule 4 substance, which is like totally illegal, and then you have states that treated as legal. So in typical messy American fashion, we have this contradiction between state, federal, and local laws, like all overlaying the same geographic territory. But like the federal government says you're committing a felony, your state government practically welcomes it. I think that's just very American. It's part of the diffusion of power that is baked into our system. Speaking of getting baked. Oh.
We have one important thing that we need to address. That is the latest exciting GOP presidential debate. This one will take place in Miami, Florida, the city of the future, the capital of the emerging Bitcoin empire. And it's not really clear how much of an event this is. Once again, I think we keep returning to it, but somehow we're drawn back. I guess we're old. We're Gen X, we're millennials. We have this sense that a presidential debate should be important, but again, how important is it that the GOP candidates get together and discuss the future of the country? It's not clear.
We shouldn't even discuss it. It's just I don't know why it's happening. I guess it's a vice presidential tryout for Vivek again. But it is funny. I mean, before we started recording, Matthew and I were talking about how a certain kind of conservative pundit is back to playing a certain kind of game that I played in 2015-16, where we thought, okay, now let's game this out. If Cruz drops out and Rubio endorses Trump, and then, whatever, this or that, this like sort of circuitous path is traversed by the party, then you can block Trump. And I think that we're back to that. So people are like, so-and-so drops out. If such and such stops then wasting money, DeSantis concedes, then maybe Nikki Haley will be the kind of consensus.
There are still a few people playing this. There are fewer who have great hopes in the possibility of Trump, being foiled by a Ted Cruz-led rebellion at the GOP convention, and the credentialed delegates switch their votes from what the state. Kind of this long before we had kind of esoteric theories of how Trump might win the 2020 election through the alternate slates of electors. Long before that occurred, there was something really similar within the GOP about foiling Trump. We're like, well, what if we have kind of, the electors kind of act differently in this way than what the kind of results are. And so a lot of those people have since departed the GOP. They're riding with Biden. It looks like Trump. I guess we can't call him the comeback kid. That's Bill Clinton's designation. Well, Trump redivivus. We'll have to see what happens. But
by the way, before we close, in the spirit of corrections on the podcast, I apologize. I meant to say that marijuana is a Schedule 1 substance, which is the one the federal government takes most seriously it's in the same category as like LSD. Schedule 4 are drugs that are considered low possibility for abuse, like Xanax.
Any thoughts on the debate quickly, Jeff? Nina, are you going to tune in tonight? Our listeners probably will have already seen it if they're one of the 180,000 Americans that just decides to tune in.
I mean, the only thing that does seem notable that I think I brought up in a previous discussion is, I'm interested in whether there's kind of you've seen this a bit from Tucker, you've seen it from Thomas Massey. I think Trump's instincts are towards this kind of, America first sort of restraint, but that is probably not going to play out in being, less supportive of Israel. So I think that's maybe a limit of it in his case for various reasons. But, it is striking that you have the kind of reemergence of the kind of full spectrum neocon hawk of the Lindsey Graham or seemingly Nikki Haley type, who's just sort of like, yeah, we can do it all. We can, go to war against Iran, Russia, and China all at once. We can do it. We're going to do it. It's all going to be great. And so that does kind of carve out the space for, I guess Vivek has attempted to position himself somewhere in this area of a kind of more realistic, more restrained, relationship with the rest of the world, perhaps even including the Middle East and Israel particularly. I think there is sort of an interesting question of how that plays out. We can see on the Democratic side, standing by Israel, but then using that leverage to try to force them to be more restrained and in their, to get them to use smaller bombs was one of the requests, I believe, recently. So, you can imagine a sort of synthesis where, somebody like Trump basically says, all right, we're going to cut Israel loose. And on one hand, that means, we won't be sending them as much money. But on the other hand, it means they can really go to town against Hamas and just, carpet bomb the whole Gaza Strip. And so, there's some version that you can imagine working out both in favor of a kind of hardline Zionist position, but also a sort of, America withdrawing from the world and attending to its own interests sort of position. So I don't know. I'm kind of curious to see what comes out of that. And I assume in this debate, there's going to be a huge amount of discussion, basically with someone like Haley leading the way as far as, carving out the maximalist sort of interventionist position, some of the other figures trying to offer different versions of a more moderate position. And then the big question is going to be kind of how Trump positions himself. Then, one final thing is we published a piece today about how, essentially the establishment is coming around to the restrainers argument on Ukraine, which I suppose means that, if that is the case, then someone like Trump has less of an opportunity to distinguish himself, at least on that major foreign policy issue, if his position, which has long been that we need to sort of pursue peace and diplomacy, becomes the standard one of the foreign policy establishment, then, he doesn't quite have the same distinguishing, position in relation to the rest of the field.
I mean, the GOP debate's just really been kind of a freak show, and not even an interesting one, because you have just, first of all, just like random man who wandered in off the street, Doug Burgum. I don't know who that is. Let's not get into it. You've got Vivek. Chrissy called him Chat GPT. There were several questions in a recent debate I watched where people were called on to raise their hands if they agreed with something. Vivek was very good at raising his hand. He was almost always the first. It's probably something he picked up in childhood and has been a master of ever since. You have, Mike Pence kind of intoning these, solemn and sonorous phrases, authorized version of the, Reagan playbook. And the one candidate who seems a little more polished, a little more just adult and like a real person, one of them is Nikki Haley. She is just more impressive than a lot of these people, But this is the thing, it really shows, how we got Trump, how we got these populist crises. So much of what she says is really, really unhinged, and her record is not something on which to build in a lot of ways, not just in foreign policy, but domestically too. That's really the problem, not just of the GOP, but of some of our other parties across the West. Yeah, it's why we have Trump, and none of these people is going to come anywhere close to displacing him. With that, Thanks, Jeff, Nina, Sarab. Thanks to listeners. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe. Great time to check out the magazine. Get a subscription for yourself. Catch you next week.